Hello, and welcome back to our quiet corner of history, a place to unwind and let the stories of the past gently carry you towards rest. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always find it fascinating to see where you're listening from. So, feel free to comment with your city or country. It's a wonderful, silent connection across time and space. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The lingering shadows of twilight. Imagine yourself there, in a small medieval village nestled in a shallow valley. The sun, a disk of molten copper, has just slipped behind the jagged line of the western hills. This is not just the end of a day. It is a transformation. A tangible change is taking place, a feeling you know deep in your bones. The air, once warm with the day's labor, now carries a distinct chill, raising small hairs on your arms. The world, which felt so solid and real under the bright sun, now seems to grow thin, like a worn piece of cloth. This is the hour of twilight, a liminal space between light and dark, a time when the veil between worlds is thought to be at its most porous. The sounds of the village are changing, too. The boisterous shouts from the blacksmith's forge have been replaced by the rhythmic, metallic clang of him tidying his tools. The chatter and laughter spilling from the single alehouse door is becoming more subdued as patrons drain their mugs and think of the walk home. From the small pastures bordering the village, you can hear the low, contented sounds of livestock settling in for the night, their soft chewing and occasional sighs a comforting, earthy chorus. But beneath these familiar noises, a new silence is growing, a heavy quiet that seems to absorb sound. This is the quiet that belongs to the night. And in this quiet, you know that things begin to stir. This is not a vague, childish fear of the dark. It is a core belief. As certain as the rising of the sun, demons are a real and constant threat. They are not merely distant, theological concepts reserved for sermons. They are a physical presence, hiding in the growing darkness, their malevolence clinging to the evening mist that rises from the river. They wait in the deep woods that border your village, in the unlit corners of a barn, or beneath the rickety bridge you must cross to get home. As you pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and quicken your pace on the muddy track, every snapped twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow that seems to dance just at the edge of your vision is a potential menace. This fear was so structured that it had a timetable. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky tidbit of medieval life, the concept of specific demon hours. Twilight. This very time we are imagining was the first danger zone. It was believed to be the time for lesser spirits and tricksters' imps that might sour the milk, rearrange tools in your workshop, or whisper misleading directions to a weary traveler. But the truly dreaded time, the prime time for evil, was the dead of night, roughly the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning. This was the domain of more powerful, more malevolent entities. Demons, it seems, were very punctual and had a rather predictable work schedule, which was perhaps a small comfort in itself. Knowing when to be most vigilant was a form of defense. In the face of such a pervasive and structured threat, the community needed a defender. And this leads us to a central, mainstream fact of medieval society, the absolute importance of the local parish priest. He was more than a man who led Sunday Mass. He was the village's primary spiritual defender, the frontline soldier in a constant, unseen war. As dusk deepens, you might see his lone figure, Father Thomas perhaps, making his rounds. His dark cassock is a stark shape against the fading light, his hand perhaps resting on a small wooden cross worn smooth with use. His very presence is a ward, the gentle, resonant toll of the church bell calling the faithful to vespers. The evening prayer is not just a call to worship, it is a shield of sound, a holy vibration pushing back against the encroaching dark. He possessed the tools of this spiritual warfare, the holy water to purify a home, the Latin prayers to banish a lurking presence, and the sheer force of faith that was believed to be anathema to the demonic. He was the community's anchor in a sea of supernatural fear. But where did this potent, all-encompassing fear of demons truly originate? Was it all dictated from the high pulpits of cathedrals and the meticulously copied pages of Scripture? It's a fascinating question, and one where historians still argue how much of this demon fear was formal church doctrine versus the survival of pre-Christian, pagan folk beliefs. The church certainly taught of Satan, of temptation, and of a very real hell. But the specific character of many of these village demons, the hairy man of the woods, the spirit of the bog, the creature that tangles the manes of horses, feels much older. They seem less like fallen angels and more like the old nature gods and spirits of the land, repurposed and rebranded for a new theological age. It was a career change nobody asked for, as ancient guardians of the forest were demoted to malevolent fiends lurking in the shadows. This blending of old folk magic and new Christian theology created a uniquely potent and terrifying worldview, one that filled the twilight with a deep and personal dread. So as you finally reach your own small home, the scent of wood smoke from your hearth, a welcome comfort, you hurry inside, your heart still beating a little faster than usual. You slide the heavy wooden bar across the door, a simple, physical act that feels as much a spiritual defense as a practical one. You pull the heavy, rough-hewn wooden door shut behind you, the simple iron latch falling into place with a satisfying, solid clunk. The air inside the cottage is immediately different from the world outside. It's warmer, for one, and carries the thick, comforting scent of wood smoke, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the faint, earthy smell of the daub walls themselves. Your home is a small single room, its walls a lattice of woven hazel branches, or wattle, packed with a mixture of wet soil, clay, sand, and straw. It's a humble construction, but it is your sanctuary, a bubble of relative safety carved out of the vast, indifferent wilderness. The single window is little more than a slit, covered by a wooden shutter, now barred, leaving the interior illuminated only by the gentle dancing light from the center of the room. Here, in the heart of your home, the fears of the forest and the open road recede, but they are replaced by a different, more intimate sort of anxiety. The dangers are no longer monstrous beasts or spectral processions, but unseen guests who might slip in through the smallest crack, invited by a moment of carelessness. This is the realm of domestic demons, of malevolent sprites and insidious influences that seek to curdle the milk, spoil the grain, and whisper unsettling thoughts into your ear as you try to find sleep. The sanctity of the home is not a given. It is a state that must be constantly maintained through ritual, vigilance, and a healthy respect for the old ways. Your eyes are drawn, as they always are, to the central hearth. More than just a source of warmth, this circle of stone is the anchor of your entire world. The symbolic and practical importance of the central hearth fire was paramount in daily life, serving as a beacon of protection against the dark, both physically and spiritually. It is the sun of your small universe. Physically, its radiant heat pushes back the creeping chill that seeps through the walls, keeping your fingers from stiffening and your breath from misting in the air. Its light is a shield, turning the deep, oppressive blackness of the night into a soft tapestry of flickering shadows. It is where your meager meals are cooked, the iron pot hanging from a hook over the embers, bubbling away with whatever nourishment the day has provided. But its spiritual power is just as crucial. The fire itself is seen as a purifying element, a fragment of celestial light here on Earth. Its crackle and pop are a constant, living sound that wards off the unnatural silence where dark things thrive. The smoke that curls up towards the hole in the thatched roof is believed to carry prayers and intentions upwards, while the light itself is anathema to creatures born of shadow. To let the fire die out completely overnight was not just impractical, it was an invitation to misfortune, leaving the home spiritually unguarded and vulnerable until the embers could be coaxed back to life in the morning. A house with a dead hearth was a house without a soul, a cold and empty vessel waiting to be filled by whatever might be passing by in the dark. This constant, low-level spiritual maintenance extends to every corner of the home and every chore. You might think, for instance, of the simple act of sweeping the packed earth floor at the end of the day. A tidy habit, a way to bring order before settling down for the night. But the timing is everything. One of the most persistent and curious superstitions was the belief that demons could be invited in by sweeping dust out the door after sunset. The logic, in its own way, is sound. The dust and debris of the day are not just inert matter. They are imbued with the lingering essence of the household's activities, its luck, its spiritual residue. To sweep it out into the encroaching darkness is to carelessly discard the home's protective aura, creating a vacuum that malevolent forces would be all too happy to fill. Worse, it was thought to create a cleared, welcoming path leading directly from the night into your home, as if you'd laid out a tiny, dusty red carpet for any passing imp. I suppose it gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, letting the day go. This belief wasn't an isolated quirk. Many household objects and actions were subject to similar rules. A knife left with its blade pointing up could attract misfortune. Spilling salt required a pinch to be thrown over the left shoulder, the devil's shoulder, to blind him before he could take advantage of the bad omen. Even an echo in the room could be a spirit mockingly repeating your words. It's enough to make you wonder if misplacing your keys was less about forgetfulness and more about the work of a particularly bothersome pixie with a strange sense of humor. It creates a fascinating question for those of us looking back. Scholars still debate whether these domestic rituals were born from genuine, heart-pounding terror, or were simply ingrained traditions whose original demonic meaning was partially forgotten. Was the person sweeping the floor in the afternoon, carefully piling the dust in a corner to be disposed of in the morning, actively thinking, "I must not do this at night, or a demon will enter my house"? Or had it become a simple, unquestioned habit, a piece of folk wisdom passed down from mother to daughter, like a family recipe? The original, terrifying reason might have faded into the background, leaving behind only the comforting rhythm of the way things are done. It's much like how some people today won't walk under a ladder. They don't truly expect a cascade of cosmic misfortune. It just feels wrong. The echo of the old fear remains long after the belief itself has softened into mere custom. For you, in this small, smoky room, the distinction is meaningless. The rituals are part of the fabric of life, as natural as breathing. You check the shutter, you tend the fire, you save the sweeping for the morning light. As the embers glow and cast their warm, golden light upon the rough walls, the cottage feels secure. The world outside, with its palpable and imagined dangers, is held at bay. Here, within these walls, there is a fragile, carefully curated peace, a small victory against the encroaching dark. As you settle deeper into the quiet of your surroundings, your attention is drawn to a distant, yet persistent, sound. It's the deep, resonant tone of a village church bell. It's not a frantic alarm, nor a cheerful peal for a wedding. Instead, it is a slow, methodical, and profoundly grounding hum that seems to vibrate not just in the air, but in the very soil beneath you. This is the sound of safety. In a world where darkness felt like a tangible, creeping force, the village church was the ultimate bastion against evil, a stone and timber fortress of divine power in a demonic world, and its voice was the bell. Imagine the deep bronze cup, weighing hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds, swinging in the belfry. Each pull of the rope by the bell ringer sends a wave of sound rolling across the fields and into the dense woods. This sound is more than a simple call to prayer. It is an active form of protection. This brings us to a common and vital practice. Of the time, the ringing of church bells was not just for marking the hours or calling the faithful to Mass. It was a spiritual weapon. Villagers believed the sacred vibrations of a consecrated bell could physically drive away demons, who were thought to despise the holy sound. When a vicious thunderstorm would roll in, flashing lightning and roaring thunder, it was often seen as a direct demonic assault. The immediate response was to ring the church bell. Its powerful, calming tone, a counter-frequency to the chaos of the storm, a declaration that this village was under a higher protection. The same was true for plague. As sickness swept through the land, the bells would toll, a constant, prayerful hum intended to purify the air and repel the invisible evils that carried the disease. The bell was the village's audible shield. The church itself was the source of this power. Picture its form rising from the landscape. It is not merely a building. It is a fortress. Its walls are thick, made of cold, solid stone that seems to absorb the worries of those who enter. The narrow windows, often just slits in the older structures, feel less like sources of light and more like defensive positions. The great wooden door, bound with iron, is a gate against the terrors of the night. Inside, the very architecture is designed to lift the soul and repel the profane. The high, malevolent, vaulted ceilings draw your eyes upward, away from the mud and toil of the earth and toward the heavens. The light, filtered through the rich colors of a stained glass window, paints the stone floor in hues of sapphire and ruby, transforming the dusty air into something sacred. The church is a sanctuary in the most literal sense, a consecrated space where evil simply could not gain a foothold. This concept of consecrated ground created a fascinating and specific fear associated with the church's perimeter. The churchyard, where the dead were buried, was hallowed ground, protected by the church's aura. But historians and folklorists point to a specific anxiety surrounding the land immediately, bordering. The churchyard, a thin strip of what was sometimes called unhallowed ground. This was the boundary, the very edge of the sanctuary's reach. It was believed that evil spirits, demons, or the restless dead, unable to cross into the sacred space, would congregate right along this fence line or wall. They were stuck, pressed against the invisible barrier, resentful and waiting. It was the demonic equivalent of loitering just outside a club you aren't allowed into. For a villager walking home late at night, the journey past the churchyard was a double-edged sword. Inside the wall was safety. Right outside, it was the most dangerous place to be. You can almost feel the quickened pace, the averted eyes, the shiver that runs down the spine as one hurries past that liminal, haunted border. Once safely inside the church's influence, the faithful had an entire arsenal of spiritual tools at their disposal. You would approach the stone font near the entrance, its basin holding holy water. Dipping your fingers into the cool liquid and making the sign of the cross was a personal act of purification and protection, washing away spiritual grime. Elsewhere, you might see a reliquary, an often ornate container of wood, ivory, or precious metal, housing a splinter of bone from a saint or a thread from a martyr's robe. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were believed to be conduits of divine power, radiating sanctity. To pray before a relic, or perhaps to be lucky enough to touch the container it was in, was to connect directly with the holiness of a figure who had already triumphed over earthly suffering and evil. These physical objects, the water, the relics, the crucifixes hanging on the walls, were tangible assurances of God's power. Yet, this reliance on physical objects leads to a question that remains a point of thoughtful scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the average villager placed more faith in the inherent, almost magical power of these physical objects, or in the importance of their own personal piety and prayer. Was it the holy water itself that offered protection, or the faith of the person using it? Did a relic work automatically, like a spiritual battery, or did its power only manifest for the truly devout? For some, carrying a blessed medal was all the assurance they needed. For others, no object could replace the power of a heartfelt prayer, a confession of sin, and a life lived in accordance with the Church's teachings. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in between. These tools were not mutually exclusive. The physical objects likely served as focal points for personal faith, tangible anchors for belief in an intangible world. The bell ringer, for instance, pulling on the heavy rope, no doubt felt he was doing a great service, and probably had the most spiritually toned biceps in the county. His physical action, combined with the faith of the community listening to the bell, created a powerful unified shield of belief. And so that sound, the bell's protective hum, continues to roll over the hills, a testament to a faith that was both deeply personal and powerfully communal. Let your mind now drift away from the warm, communal heart of the village. We are walking, you and I, down a path that grows less certain with every step. The familiar, packed earth gives way to looser soil, and the comforting glow of distant hearths is swallowed by the deep, velvety blackness of the countryside. Our destination is a place of profound significance, a location that exists both physically and symbolically on the very edge of the known world. We are heading for the crossroads, and we are arriving at the stroke of midnight. Imagine the scene. Two simple dirt tracks intersect under a vast, star-dusted sky. A sliver of a moon hangs like a polished bone, casting long, distorted shadows that twist and writhe with every gentle rustle of the wind in the gnarled branches of a solitary oak. The air here is different. It's cooler, thinner, and carries the scent of damp earth, wild herbs, and a certain stillness that feels ancient and watchful. This is a liminal space, a place of transition and decision, belonging neither to one road nor the other, neither to the village nor to the wilderness. It is a place outside of society's walls, beyond the reach of the church bell, and therefore outside of its perceived protection. And in the medieval mind, such a place was rife with possibility and with peril. This reputation was not merely folklore. It was reinforced by a grim and very real practice. For this lonely intersection was often a cemetery for those who could not be buried in consecrated ground. Imagine the heavy silence of a small, somber procession arriving in the dead of night, their lanterns creating a small, trembling bubble of light. Here, they would enter the bodies of those who had died by suicide, the unbaptized infants who had not been formally welcomed into the Christian fold, and the executed criminals whose sins were deemed too great for hallowed earth. The logic, from their perspective, was a blend of pragmatism and deep-seated superstition. It was believed that a crossroads would utterly confuse a troubled spirit. A ghost, rising from its grave, would be faced with four identical paths, unable to determine which one led back to the village to haunt the living. It was a spiritual labyrinth designed to contain and neutralize a restless soul. Honestly, it seems like a lot of work to go through. You'd think a ghost would have better things to do than get befuddled by a lack of signage. This fear of spirits returning from the grave was palpable, a genuine and pressing concern that shaped the very landscape. But the unquiet human dead were not the only entities one might encounter here. This was a place for bargains, a neutral territory where the mortal and supernatural worlds could meet. Folklore is filled with tales of musicians selling their souls for unmatched talent, of desperate lovers seeking charms, and of ambitious men seeking power, all striking their deals at a crossroads at midnight. This belief was so specific that theologians even cataloged the potential threats. Take, for instance, the peculiar figure of the meridian demon. This was a special class of tempter, believed to appear at moments of temporal transition, either high noon or deep midnight. Monks, praying or working in solitude, were considered especially vulnerable to this demon, which would whisper temptations of sloth, doubt, or worldly pleasure. It seems a bit unfair to have a demon working both the day and the night shift, but I suppose temptation never sleeps. The belief that such liminal spaces were spiritually charged is incredibly ancient, which leads to a fascinating point of contention. There is an ongoing debate among scholars about how much of this crossroads folklore was a direct inheritance from older traditions, and how much was a later creation of Christian demonology. The Romans, for example, had the Lars Compitals, guardian spirits of the crossroads who were honored with festivals. Many Germanic and Celtic pagan traditions also held intersections as sacred or powerful places. One school of thought suggests that as Christianity spread, it didn't erase these beliefs, but rather reframed them. The old gods and spirits of the crossroads were demoted, transformed into the demons and devils of the new faith. Another view posits that while some elements may be ancient, the specific narrative of soul selling and demonic pacts was largely a product of later medieval anxieties about heresy, witchcraft, and the devil's ever-present influence. It's a classic case of historical rebranding. Really, the old management is out, and the new management has put a fresh and decidedly more sinister coat of paint on the place. As you stand here, in the quiet heart of this imagined intersection, you can almost feel the weight of all those centuries of belief pressing in. The rustle of leaves could be the whisper of a confused ghost. The glint of moonlight on a wet stone could be the watchful eye of something otherworldly. The crossroads was a place of fear, yes, but also a place of potent possibility, where the rules of the ordinary world were suspended, and for a single, breathless moment, anything could happen. The narrative of the demon, thus far an external force, a tempter in the desert, a fallen star, a shadowy figure at a crossroads, now turns inward. It finds a new home, a new battleground, not in the desolate wastes or the hallowed halls of a church, but within the very fabric of the human body. In this worldview, the physical self was a mirror of the spiritual. A healthy body often reflected a pure soul, while sickness was something more than a mere biological event. It was a sign, a crack in the armor, a symptom of a deeper malady of the spirit. The lines between medicine, morality, and theology blurred into a single, cohesive understanding of human frailty. A fever was not simply an elevated temperature. It was the heat of divine judgment, or the friction of a demonic presence. A persistent cough was not just an irritation of the lungs. It was the soul trying to expel a spiritual toxin. Sickness was often understood as a direct consequence of sin. This belief gave the world a strange and perhaps terrifying kind of order. If your suffering had a moral cause, then it also had a moral solution: repentance, prayer, and a return to a righteous path. But it also meant that every ache and pain carried the weight of potential damnation, opening the door for demonic influence to seep into the cracks of a weakened spirit. This connection was not vague or metaphorical. It was codified and taught with a chilling specificity. The most well-known example of this is, of course, the 7 deadly sins. these were not just abstract moral failings or personality flaws. They were taught as literal gateways, specific vulnerabilities through which demons, each with its own dark specialty, could gain entry to a person's soul. Imagine each sin as a different kind of key, unlocking a particular door into the fortress of your being. Pride, the sin of Lucifer himself, was seen as the master key. It created a hollowness in the soul that a demon of vanity could fill, whispering affirmations that slowly severed one's connection to humility and to God. Envy, that corrosive feeling of wanting what that another has, was believed to attract a slithering, whispering entity that would poison one's perspective, turning the world a sickly shade of green and making contentment impossible. The demon of wrath was a creature of fire and impulse, entering through a flash of uncontrolled anger to stoke the embers of resentment into a destructive blaze. Greed invited a grasping, hungry demon, one that could never be satisfied, convincing its host that security lay in accumulation, all while it spiritually starved them. Sloth, often misunderstood as simple laziness, was a far more dangerous spiritual apathy, a damp, heavy fog that extinguished the fires of faith and ambition. This sin was an invitation to a demon that drains color and purpose from life, making every effort seem pointless. A demon of gluttony was not so much interested in the food itself, but in the lack of control, feasting on the host's vitality. And lust, of course, was a gateway for spirits that promised fleeting pleasure while corrupting the very idea of love and connection. For a medieval person, indulging in these sins was akin to leaving your front door unlocked and a window open in a very bad neighborhood, knowing full well who or what was lurking outside. It's a lot more pressure than just remembering to file your taxes on time, a task which, I suspect, might even confound a demon of greed. This belief in spiritual vulnerability extended beyond grand theological sins and into the minute, unconscious actions of daily life. Consider the simple, universal act of a yawn, a deep, involuntary intake of air, a stretching of the jaw, a momentary lapse. To the medieval mind, that open, unguarded mouth was a perfect, fleeting opportunity. It was believed a demon, ever watchful, could seize that moment to fly directly into your body and take up residence. This wasn't a metaphor. It was a genuine, practical fear. This is the origin of the custom of covering one's mouth when yawning an instinctual, physical ward against spiritual invasion. You can almost picture a tiny mischievous demon, like a gnat, zipping towards an open mouth, only to be thwarted by a well-timed hand. A similar logic applied to the sneeze. That sudden, violent expulsion of air was thought to momentarily eject the soul from the body, leaving it vulnerable to being snatched by a passing evil spirit. The subsequent blessing, "God bless you," was not just a polite pleasantry. It was a reflexive prayer, a quick shield thrown up to protect the dislodged soul and guide it safely back into its home before anything malevolent could take its place. It's rather charming, in a way, to think of our social niceties having such dramatic, supernatural origins. A demon that successfully navigates a yawn might be quite disappointed to find only the lingering essence of that morning's coffee. Given this pervasive spiritual explanation for illness, one might wonder where medicine fit in. This leads to a fascinating area of scholarly debate. Historians still argue about the complex interplay between early medical theories, like the four humors, and the prevailing belief in demonic causality for disease. The theory of the four humors, inherited from the ancient Greeks, was the dominant medical model for centuries. It posited that health depended on the perfect balance of four fluids in the body blood: phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was simply an imbalance of these humors. So, Did the physician and the priest offer competing diagnoses? Not usually. The two systems were not seen as mutually exclusive. They were often beautifully, if complexly, intertwined. One could believe that a demon of melancholy had taken root in their spirit, and that this spiritual affliction was causing an excess of black bile in the body, leading to the physical symptoms of depression. Conversely, one might believe that a naturally melancholic temperament, an excess of black bile, made one's soul a more fertile ground for that same demon to flourish. The doctor might prescribe a change in diet, certain herbs, or even bloodletting to rebalance the humors. At the same time, the priest might prescribe prayer, fasting, and confession to cleanse the soul. Both treatments were aimed at the same problem, just attacking it from different angles. One physical, one spiritual. It was a holistic approach, born of a world that did not separate the body from the soul. Getting a second opinion must have been an interesting experience. Going from a doctor talking about your phlegm to a priest asking about your recent sins. The body was a vessel, and keeping it healthy was both a medical and a deeply moral imperative, a constant, quiet war fought against the sickness of sin. Your gaze drifts from the neatly furrowed earth of the common fields, lifting towards the place where the light gives way to shadow. There, at the edge of human endeavor, stands the forest. It is a solid wall of green and black, a stark, vertical line against the horizontal order of the village. You imagine the air growing cooler as you approach it, the familiar scent of sun-baked soil and cut hay replaced by the rich, complex perfume of damp earth, decaying leaves, and pine. This is the tree line, and in the medieval mind, it is more than a boundary between field and forest. It is the border between worlds. To the village, structured and sanctified by the church bell, the forest represents the antithesis of divine order. It is a realm of chaos, untamed and unpredictable. Its paths are not straight and purposeful like the furrows in a field. They are winding, misleading, and can vanish without warning. The trees grow not in neat rows, but in a tangled, competitive mass, their branches interlocking overhead to blot out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. This was a place where the rules of man and God seemed to lose their hold. It was here, in this deep, dark wood, that the imagination populated the shadows with all that it feared. It was the natural habitat for wolves, bears, and outlaws, but also for things far less natural: demons, malevolent spirits, and monsters of every description. The rustle of leaves was not just the wind, but perhaps a goblin. A strange light flickering in the distance was not a natural gas, but a will-o'-the-wisp, luring travelers to their doom. The woods were a living, breathing entity, and its whispers were not to be trusted. This profound fear of the woods as a chaotic, demonic realm found its ultimate expression in a legend that haunted the winter nights across much of Europe. Imagine a storm is brewing, but the sound you hear is not thunder. It is the distant baying of hounds, a frantic, unearthly noise that seems to come from the clouds themselves. Then, a rumbling, like the pounding of 1,000 hooves, not on the ground, but across the very fabric of the night sky. This was the coming of the wild hunt. It was a ghostly procession, a cavalcade of spectral hunters and their hounds, thundering through the heavens on phantom steeds. They were often led by a great, fearsome figure, sometimes a damned soul from local history, a biblical villain like Cain, or, in many Germanic traditions, the old god Odin, now recast as a demonic chieftain. To witness this procession was a terrifying omen. It was said to presage war, plague, or your own imminent demise. Those unfortunate enough to be caught outdoors when the hunt passed were sometimes swept up into its horrifying ranks, doomed to ride with them until the end of time. It was the original late-night express, and you really didn't want a ticket. The legend served as a powerful deterrent, a supernatural curfew keeping good folk indoors, reinforcing the idea that the night, like the forest, belonged to these chaotic, otherworldly forces. Scholars still debate whether the wild hunt was a demonized folk memory of the old pagan gods, or a distinctively medieval creation. The argument for it being a remnant of paganism is compelling. A procession led by a god like Odin, who was associated with wanderers, poetry, and the fury of battle, could easily be transformed by Christian missionaries into a terrifying demonic host. It was a way of taking the old beliefs and twisting them into something cautionary, something to be feared rather than worshipped. On the other hand, some historians argue it was a more organic medieval invention, a way to personify and explain frightening nocturnal phenomena. The roaring sound of a powerful gale tearing through a forest, the eerie cries of migrating geese flying high overhead at night in a world without scientific explanations. What better way to make sense of these terrifying unseen sounds than to imagine a ghostly hunt sweeping across the sky? While the wild hunt represented a vast, celestial terror, the fear of the woods also manifested in much smaller, more intimate ways. The folklore of the time assigned supernatural properties to all manner of plants and places, but few were as respected and feared as a specific tree. Picture a gnarled, crooked tree with rough, gray bark and clusters of creamy white flowers, or dark, purplish berries. This is the elder tree. While its berries and flowers were useful in folk medicine, the tree itself was often believed to be the home of a powerful, and sometimes malevolent, nature spirit. In Danish folklore, she was called the Hildemoer, the Elder Mother. To cut down an elder tree without first asking her permission was to invite swift and certain misfortune. It was said she would follow the wood into your home, causing sickness, poltergeists, or even death. A cradle made of elderwood was unthinkable, as the elder mother might come and pinch the baby, leaving it black and blue. It seems that even in the Middle Ages, you had to contend with a kind of supernatural homeowners association, and its rules were not to be taken lightly. This belief imbued the forest with a sense of granular, personal danger. It wasn't just a big, scary place. Every rock and tree could potentially house a spirit that needed to be appeased. A daily reminder of the unseen world humming with power just beyond the village fields. For a person of the time, being lost in the woods wasn't just about the physical danger of getting lost. It was about trespassing, about being in a place where you were no longer welcome, and where every shadow watched you with ancient, knowing eyes. You contemplate what a demon actually looks like. Try to picture it, just for a moment, in the quiet darkness of your room. Does your mind conjure an image of crimson skin, a pointed tail, and a pair of curling horns, perhaps a wicked grin and a trident held in a clawed hand? It's a powerful, almost cartoonish image, so ingrained in our culture that it feels timeless. Yet, this familiar picture is merely the latest draft in a long, evolving history of how humanity has chosen to visualize its deepest anxieties. The shape of fear, it turns out, is ever-changing. In the early medieval world, the concept was far less refined and far more chaotic. Imagine a scribe, a monk hunched over a sheet of vellum in the faint, flickering light of a scriptorium. The air is cool and smells of old parchment, beeswax, and the sharp tang of iron gall ink. Outside, the world is a vast, often frightening place, filled with deep forests and unexplainable phenomena. When this monk was tasked with illustrating a demon, he wasn't trying to create a character. He was trying to depict a concept, the perversion of divine order. The result was often a chimeric beast, a nightmarish collage of animal parts. You might see a creature with the snarling head of a wolf, the body of a man, the talons of an eagle, and the scaled tail of a serpent. It was a visual representation of chaos, an entity stitched together from all the things that lurked in the shadows of the natural world. These were not subtle tempters. They were monsters, designed to evoke pure, visceral revulsion. They were everything that was wrong, unnatural, and broken. This brings us to a fascinating question that still occupies the minds of scholars. It is still debated whether the grotesque gargoyles and manuscript illuminations created by the church primarily shaped the popular image of a demon, or if they were merely reflecting pre-existing folk beliefs. Was the stone carver chiseling a winged monstrosity high on the facade of a new cathedral, giving the common person a new nightmare to fear? Or was he simply giving form to the shadowy creatures that already populated peasant folklore and hearthside tales? The woodwights, the goblins, the ancient spirits of the land, now rebranded under a new theological framework. It's a chicken and egg scenario, a gentle puzzle of historical influence. The artists and theologians may have provided the official iconography, but the raw material of fear, the fear of the dark, of the wild, of the unknown, was already there, waiting to be given a name and a face. But the depiction of a demon was never just about sight. There was another, more pervasive sensory detail that clung to these encounters. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of a struck match, that brief, acrid puff of sulfur. Now, amplify it. It was a near universal belief that demons, regardless of the form they took, gave off a faint but unmistakable smell of sulfur and brimstone. This wasn't just a metaphor. In a world where volcanic vents and sulfurous hot springs were seen as literal fissures in the earth, porous entryways to the underworld, this scent was believed to be the actual aroma of hell itself. It was the foul air of the pit, clinging to its denizens like a persistent cologne. Imagine being a medieval farmer, walking home at twilight. The path is lonely, the woods are dark, and suddenly you catch that rotten egg whiff on the breeze. The fear would be immediate and profound, a sensory confirmation that something unholy was near. It was a kind of infernal body odor, a dead giveaway that you weren't alone. As the centuries wore on, however, and the Middle Ages matured, the shape of fear began to shift. The raw, brutish monster of the Dark Ages slowly gave way to something far more insidious. This reflects the visual evolution of the devil and his demons in art, from chimeric beasts in the early Middle Ages to more seductive, humanoid tempters by the later period. As towns grew into cities and society became more complex, the nature of temptation changed. The greatest threat was no longer a monster's leaping from the woods, but the subtle poison of pride, greed, or lust whispered in the corridors of power or the quiet of one's own heart. And so, the demon adapted. Art began to depict demons not as grotesque beasts, but as alluringly human. A demon might appear as a handsome, charming courtier, offering a king the secret to defeating his enemies. Or perhaps a beautiful woman with a captivating smile, promising forbidden knowledge or earthly pleasures. The horror was no longer in the monstrosity, but in the deception. The clues to their true nature became subtle, almost hidden. You might only notice the slight bulge of a cloven hoof beneath a fine silk stocking, or a pair of small vestigial horns tucked away beneath a fashionable hat. Sometimes, there was no physical tell at all, just a look in the eyes that was too knowing, a smile that didn't quite reach them. The battle was no longer against an external foe, but an internal struggle against one's own desires, which the demon now mirrored perfectly. It was the original form of catfishing. Really, just with eternal damnation as the ultimate consequence. The fear was that evil could look beautiful, that sin could look reasonable, and that the devil you know might be the one staring back at you from the mirror. This changing face shows us that fear is a reflection, not just of what scares us, but of who we are and what we value most. As you lie there, suspended in the quiet space between wakefulness and sleep, your mind drifts away from the tangible world of wood smoke and woolen blankets. It wanders down a different path, one paved not with cobblestones, but with stories. Specifically, the stories you've heard the priest tell in the hushed, incense-scented air of the church, the lives of the saints. These tales, these hagiographies, were more than just moral lessons. They were practical guides, the ultimate template for understanding and navigating the treacherous landscape of the human soul. They were a shared language for the struggle against temptation, a comfort in knowing that even the holiest of figures had faced their own demons, both literal and figurative. Of all these tales, one echoed loudest in the medieval imagination. It was the story of St. Anthony the Great, a foundational narrative of spiritual warfare. You can almost picture it, your mind painting the scene from the priest's measured words. You see a man, Anthony, alone in the vast, silent expanse of the Egyptian desert. The sun beats down by day, and a profound, star-filled cold descends by night. He is an ascetic, intentionally stripping away every worldly comfort to bring himself closer to God. But in this self-imposed isolation, he finds he is not alone at all. The quiet is filled with whispers. The emptiness is populated by visions. Hordes of demons, the stories said, descended upon him. But these were not always monstrous. Horned beasts. That would be too simple. The true trial was in their subtlety. They came to him first as temptations of the flesh he had renounced. They would conjure visions of fine meals on silver platters, the steam rising to carry the scent of roasted meat and freshly baked bread to a man subsisting on so little. They would offer the cool, silken feel of a soft bed to a man sleeping on rock and sand. They would murmur memories of a comfortable life, of warmth, of companionship, of ease. When he resisted these, they shifted their tactics, appealing to his pride. They praised his piety, his strength, telling him he was the most devout man on earth. A subtle poison meant to inflate his ego and separate him from the humility of his faith. They were like a demonic marketing department, endlessly workshopping new ways to sell damnation, and when all else failed, they would resort to brute force, appearing as fearsome beasts to beat him, hoping to break his body when they could not break his spirit. For the medieval villager, listening to this epic struggle, St. Anthony's ordeal was a map. It showed them that temptation was not a sign of personal failure, but a universal trial. His resistance provided the strategies, prayer, fasting, and an unwavering focus on the spiritual over the material. This idea of a persistent, otherworldly adversary was taken even further in a fascinating and slightly less known theological concept. Beyond the general chaos of demonic forces, some theologians pondered the existence of a guardian demon. This was not just any random imp, but a specific fiend assigned to you, and you alone, from birth. It was your personal tempter, a dark and insidious counterpart to your guardian angel. While your angel would whisper encouragement and guide you toward virtue, this fiend was a meticulous accountant of your failings. Imagine it, a shadowy clerk with a perpetually scratching quill, hovering just over your shoulder. Every selfish thought, every muttered curse, every envious glance, all of it was dutifully recorded in a great, heavy ledger. Its job was to know your specific weaknesses, the unique cracks in your resolve, and to push on those very spots. If you were prone to pride, it would engineer situations where you might receive empty praise. If you struggled with greed, it would dangle the illusion of unearned wealth before your eyes. One can only assume its demonic penmanship was immaculate, if annoyingly spiky. The concept was a chillingly personal one, transforming the grand spiritual war into an intimate, lifelong duel fought within the confines of one's own heart and mind. The power of these stories is undeniable, but their reception is a more complex matter. Historians still argue whether the average medieval villager, sitting on a rough-hewn church bench, interpreted these hagiographies as literal, historical accounts or as powerful allegorical tales. Did they truly believe that St. Anthony wrestled with a physical griffin in the desert sands? For some, the answer was likely yes. In a world where the supernatural felt viscerally real, where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds seemed thin, the idea of a corporeal demon was no great leap of faith. The devil was as real as the lord of the manor, and far more threatening. Yet, for others, and perhaps for many at the same time, the stories may have resonated on a more symbolic level. They would have understood the demons not as external monsters, but as personifications of their own internal struggles. The demon of gluttony wasn't a pot-bellied fiend with a fork, but the agonizing hunger pangs during a lean winter. The demon of sloth wasn't a sluggish beast, but the overwhelming weariness that made getting out of a cold bed to face a day of backbreaking labor feel like an impossible task. The story of the saint wasn't just a historical record, it was an allegory for the human condition. It's quite possible the average person held both beliefs at once, a literal truth and a symbolic meaning, layered together like vellum pages in a book. The stories worked either way, providing a framework to make sense of a world filled with hardship and a soul filled with contradictions. And in the deep quiet of the night, recalling these tales was a way of arming oneself for the small, unseen trials that the next day would surely bring. The raw, physical fear of a monstrous entity, of sharp claws and shadowy forms, begins to recede now, like a fever breaking. In its place, something colder, and perhaps more unsettling, settles in your mind. The fear becomes intellectual, almost formal. It shifts from the terror of being an unwilling victim to the far more chilling possibility of being a willing participant. You begin to consider not just being tormented by a demon, but willingly, consciously, entering into a pact with one. This is the realm of the devil's legal contract, where damnation is not a random tragedy, but a calculated transaction, signed, sealed, and delivered. It's a fear born not in the dark forest, but in the quiet study, under the flickering light of a candle, with the scratch of a quill on parchment. This idea wasn't just a wild fantasy whispered among the uneducated. In fact, some of the most sophisticated minds of the age were grappling with this very concept. There developed a body of complex theological arguments about how a human, using the divine gift of free will, could formally and legally renounce God. Free will, the theologians reasoned, was the ultimate test. For it to be truly free, it had to include the freedom to make the worst possible choice. It had to encompass the liberty to turn one's back on salvation and willingly enter into a binding contract with the adversary. This wasn't a simple act of sin. It was a structured renunciation. The imagined process was one of formal declarations, of inverted baptisms, and of spoken oaths that methodically unraveled the soul's connection to the divine. The deal was usually for something tangible and desperately desired immense wealth for the impoverished merchant, forbidden knowledge for the ambitious scholar, or sweeping power for the overlooked noble. In these theological frameworks, the devil wasn't just a chaotic monster, he was a cunning lawyer, exploiting the single greatest loophole in the divine plan: human choice. He didn't have to steal your soul if you were willing to sell it. Of course, a contract of such magnitude required an equally significant signature. Folklore and demonological texts became obsessed with the specific, almost bureaucratic details of these infernal agreements. A simple signature in ink, you see, was considered entirely insufficient. It was a mere mark on a page. To make the pact binding, to truly transfer ownership of something as ethereal as a soul, the signatory had to use an ink that contained the very thing being sold. This brings us to a peculiar and enduring tidbit of this lore: the rule that such pacts were invalid unless signed in the signatory's own blood. This wasn't just for dramatic effect. The belief was that blood was the physical vessel of the spiritus, the life force, the very essence of the soul. To write your name in your own blood was to infuse the contract with a piece of yourself, making the agreement an irrevocable spiritual and physical act. Imagine the scene, not with melodrama, but with a quiet, desperate solemnity. A cold room, the scent of damp stone and old books in the air. The parchment, supposedly of a strange, unearthly texture, is laid out. There are no hellish flames, only the mundane prick of a small blade on a fingertip. A single, perfect crimson bead wells up. This is the ink. The act of signing is slow, deliberate. The quill, dipped in this vital fluid, feels strangely warm against the page. It's a moment of profound, quiet horror. The transformation of life's essence into a simple legal signature on a dotted line. It's no wonder that a being who deals in such matters would probably need an excellent filing system. After all, misplacing a soul deed would be quite the administrative headache. This highly structured, legalistic fear of demonic pacts raises a fascinating question, and it's one that sparks a notable scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the fear of demonic pacts was a top-down anxiety or a bottom-up one. The top-down theory suggests that this fear was created and promoted by the clerical and intellectual elites. In a world they sought to structure and control, an abstract chaotic evil was difficult to manage. But a devil who operates like a predatory lawyer, who uses contracts and loopholes, that was a concept they could understand, define, and, most importantly, legislate against. By creating a formal process for selling one's soul, they also created a formal process for identifying and prosecuting those who might do so. It transformed messy folk beliefs into the recognizable and punishable crime of heresy. It was a way for the architects of society to build a firewall against spiritual chaos. On the other hand, the bottom-up theory posits that this fear grew organically from the soil of peasant life, from pre-Christian folk magic and deep-seated local anxieties. For centuries, people in small villages had traditions of appealing to local spirits of the woods, the rivers, the fields for help. A farmer might leave an offering to ensure a good harvest, or a young woman might whisper a charm to win the affection of a suitor. These were often morally gray transactions with the unseen world. As Christianity spread and consolidated its power, these old ways didn't simply vanish. Instead, they were recontextualized. The old nature spirit, who could curdle a neighbor's milk, was no longer just a mischievous local sprite. It was now a minor demon. And the person asking for its help wasn't just practicing folk tradition. They were engaging in a negotiation with a representative of hell. The grand theological idea of a Faustian bargain, in this view, is simply the old, rustic practice of leaving a bowl of milk out for the fairies, but scaled up and given a terrifying new name and a far, far higher price. It seems that even in the spiritual realm, there's a risk of your minor transaction being escalated to the manager. And in this case, the manager's terms and conditions are famously non-negotiable. As our journey through the medieval mind continues, the broad, general fear of the demonic begins to narrow, to focus its gaze with an unsettling intensity. It is here, in the quiet corners of villages and the hushed chambers of clerical thought, that the fear becomes gendered. You can almost feel the shift in the air, a change in the subtle currents of anxiety. The question was no longer just, how the devil attacked humanity, but who he was most likely to target. And the answer, repeated with chilling consistency, was woman. This was not a sudden invention, but the culmination of centuries of thought, a belief that laid the ideological groundwork for the terrors to come. The central Osamernchammern mainstream fact that underpinned this entire worldview was the influential and deeply misogynistic belief that women were, by their very nature, the weaker vessel. This was not simply a folk prejudice. It was a concept reinforced by the highest authorities of the age, drawing from both classical philosophy and Christian theology. Ancient Greek thinkers had written of women as being inherently less rational, more governed by emotion and passion. Later, influential church fathers absorbed and sanctified these ideas, weaving them into a narrative of moral and spiritual frailty. Imagine a woman of the time, her life already circumscribed by a rigid social order. Her physical strength was considered lesser, her mind less capable of grasping complex theological truths, and her will more pliable, more easily bent. In this framework, she became the perfect target for a spiritual predator. The devil, in his infinite cunning, was seen as a master strategist. Why waste time attempting to breach the heavily fortified castle of a pious man's soul when there was a far more accessible entry point? He was, in a sense, the ultimate unsolicited correspondent, sliding into the spiritual DMs of those he perceived as most likely to be swayed by promises of power, knowledge, or simple worldly pleasure. The logic was insidious. Her perceived weakness was not her fault, but it was her burden, a vulnerability that made her a danger to herself and to the community around her. This belief hung in the air, as tangible as the scent of wood smoke from a cottage chimney or the damp chill of a stone church. Once a woman was believed to have succumbed to these temptations, she was not thought to be left to her own devices. A pact with the devil came with certain benefits. And this leads us to a truly quirky tidbit of demonic folklore, the concept of the familiar. This was not some grand, terrifying demon prince, but a low-level, demonic entity, a gift from the devil to his new recruit. Crucially, the familiar took on an unassuming form, hiding its malevolent nature in the guise of a small animal. It might be a cat, preternaturally black, that never seemed to need to hunt. It could be a squat toad that lingered by the doorstep, its unblinking eyes seeming to watch all who came and went. Or perhaps a weasel or a stoat, quick and sly, seen darting from the barn at odd hours. Your own cat, currently plotting to trip you on the stairs or demanding food with the imperious glare of a tiny despot, would have been Exhibit A in a medieval courtroom. These creatures were believed to be more than pets. They were supernatural aids. They would whisper advice to their witch, help curdle a neighbor's milk, blight a patch of crops, or carry out small acts of magical mischief. They were fed not on scraps, but reputedly on the witch's own blood, suckled from a witch's mark, or devil's teat, an extra nipple, or unnatural blemish found somewhere on the body. The familiar was the physical proof of a diabolical bargain, a seemingly innocent creature that served as a constant, living link to the forces of darkness. It transformed the solitude of a lonely woman with a pet into a sinister conspiracy. This brings us to a complex question, one where scholars continue to debate the exact point of transition. How did the familiar figure of the village cunning woman become so thoroughly reimagined as a diabolical witch for generations? Nearly every village had a woman, or sometimes a man, who practiced a kind of simple folk magic. She was the one you went to for a poultice to soothe a burn, a charm to find a lost cow, or a potion to ease childbirth. Her craft was a blend of herbal knowledge, ancient superstition, and practical wisdom. Her remedies of herbs and bark were the medieval equivalent of a get-well-soon card. Though perhaps with a few more toadstools involved, she was often respected, sometimes feared, but generally seen as a part of the community's fabric. The debate centers on when and why the perception of her work shifted so dramatically. When did her herbal poultice cease to be a simple remedy and become a witch's brew? When did her muttered charm for finding a lost object transform into an incantation whispered in Satan's ear? The shift was not overnight. It was a slow, creeping redefinition, fueled by theological treatises, preaching friars, and a growing societal anxiety. The cunning woman's power, once seen as deriving from nature or ancient tradition, was gradually recontextualized as a gift from the devil. Her knowledge was no longer benign. It was diabolical. And with that, an integral part of village life was recast as an enemy within. Her cottage no longer a place of healing, but the local branch office of hell itself. Your thoughts return to the immediate, physical world as you lie in bed, nestled in the quiet dark of your own room. The weight of the blankets, the soft pressure of the pillow, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. These are the anchors to the here and now. In the medieval world, this very state of vulnerability, drifting on the edge of consciousness, was a frontier fraught with peril. The night was not merely an absence of light, but a different realm, one where the veil between worlds thinned, and things could cross over. Sleep was not just a rest for the weary body, but a potential battleground for the soul. This belief was not abstract. It was deeply, physically, personal. For the medieval mind, the most intimate of spaces, the bed, the body itself could be invaded. The theological and popular belief in incubi and succubi speaks to this profound anxiety. These were not mere phantoms of a bad dream. They were considered a terrifying reality. An incubus, a male demon, or a succubus, its female counterpart, was believed to descend upon sleeping mortals. Imagine the sheer terror of an experience where you feel a heavy, oppressive weight settling upon your chest, a suffocating presence that pins you to your mattress, leaving you unable to move, unable to scream. This was the classic account of a demonic nocturnal assault. The experience was described not as a fleeting nightmare, but as a physical violation, one that could leave its victim exhausted, bruised, and deeply shamed. Theologians, including the great scholastic minds of the era, debated the nature of these beings at length. They weren't just folklore. They were a documented part of the demonic arsenal. They existed, it was argued, for the primary purpose of tempting humans into the sin of lust, to torment the pious, and, in some darker tellings, to conceive a child a cambion, half human, half demon, destined for wickedness. A claim of a phantom pregnancy caused by an incubus might, in a very tight spot, explain an inconvenient conception, but it was a desperately risky defense, as it admitted to Congress with a demon, placing you squarely in the crosshairs of the local church authorities. It was, to put it mildly, a high-stakes gamble, but not all demonic intrusions were so grave or so deeply personal. Sometimes, the trouble was less about the soul and more about the sheer annoyance of a supernatural houseguest who refused to pay rent. The phenomenon we might now label a poltergeist, from the German for noisy ghost, was often interpreted in a distinctly demonic framework. It wasn't thought to be the spirit of a departed human, but rather the work of a demon, specifically a low-ranking, particularly juvenile one. Think of it as the demonic equivalent of a teenager throwing a party while their parents are out of town. These entities weren't necessarily seeking to drag your soul to perdition. They were often seen as simply bored, malicious, and looking for amusement at a household's expense. The manifestations were classic poltergeist fare, A sudden clatter of pots in the kitchen when no one was there. A stool skittering across the floor of its own accord. Pebbles being tossed against the walls from an unseen source, and incessant, irritating knocking from within the walls or beneath the floorboards. It was disruptive, frightening, and maddening. The goal was chaos and fear, a kind of cosmic harassment. You could almost picture a demonic middle manager sighing as it had to, once again, deal with complaints about some imp who kept hiding the family's wooden spoons for a laugh. Exorcisms and blessings were the prescribed cure. An attempt to serve an eviction notice on a pest who was quite literally from hell. Of course, looking back with a modern lens, we can see other patterns and potential explanations for these terrifying nocturnal experiences. And this brings us to a fascinating point of contention. Historians and scientists still argue about the likely connection between beliefs in incubi-succubi and the very real, terrifying medical phenomenon of sleep paralysis. If you've ever experienced it, you know the feeling all too well. You wake up, your mind fully alert, but your body remains completely immobile, still locked in the paralysis that prevents you from acting out your dreams. In this state of helpless awareness, a profound sense of dread often sets in. It's frequently accompanied by a feeling of immense pressure on the chest and the unshakable conviction that there is a menacing presence in the room, with you sometimes seen as a shadowy figure, sometimes just felt. The overlap is uncanny. A feeling of being pinned down, the sense of a malevolent entity, the inability to cry out for help. It's a near-perfect match for the historical descriptions of an incubus attack for a person in the medieval period, without any concept of sleep cycles or neurological glitches. What other conclusion could be drawn? It wasn't a dream. Because you were awake, it wasn't your imagination, because the weight on your chest felt utterly real. Therefore, it had to be an external, supernatural aggressor. It's a powerful reminder of how our understanding of the world shapes our interpretation of an experience that is, for the person living it, completely and terrifyingly real. Whether we call it a demon or a disconnect between brain and body. Having explored the threats that populated the medieval mind, you now consider your arsenal of protection. It was one thing to know the names of the demons that lurked in the woods and the spirits that soured the milk. It was another entirely to fight back. The villager in your small mud and wattle world did not face this spiritual warfare empty-handed. They possessed a deep and varied collection of defenses, a catalog of rituals and objects woven so tightly into the fabric of daily life that they were as common as bread and as essential as water. This was not a grand battle with swords and shields, but a quiet, constant campaign waged with whispers, herbs, and faith. The first and most personal line of defense was the one you wore, tucked beneath your rough wool or linen tunic, resting against your skin, would likely be a protective amulet. This was rarely a gleaming piece of crafted jewelry. More often, it was a small, unassuming leather pouch, the drawstring pulled tight, its surface worn smooth by constant, unconscious touch. Imagine the weight of it, a slight but persistent pressure against your chest, a silent reminder of its purpose. If you were to carefully untie the knot and empty its contents into your palm, you would not find gold or gems. Instead, you might see a pinch of coarse salt for purification, a dried sprig of rosemary for remembrance, and perhaps a single, potent clove of garlic, its sharp scent a faint but constant shield against malevolent forces. Sometimes, the amulet was even simpler, a piece of parchment, painstakingly folded into a tiny, dense square. On its surface, a literate priest or a traveling scribe might have written a single, powerful Bible verse, perhaps the opening of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, the ink a dark stain on the animal skin, the very letters believed to hold a tangible power against the unseen world. It was less a divine shield and more of a very fragrant, if slightly lumpy, necklace. These items were deeply personal. Their power derived not just from their substance, but from the belief poured into them, a small portable fortress against the anxieties of the world. But some threats were too great for a simple charm. For afflictions that had already breached the outer defenses, a persistent fever that would not break, a wasting sickness that baffled the local herbalist, or a deep melancholy that settled over a soul like a fog, more potent and elaborate measures were called for. Here, folk practice and deep faith mingled in fascinating and beautiful ways. Picture a loved one, pale and listless in their straw-stuffed bed, the air in the small cottage thick with the scent of sickness and wood smoke. A ritual known as measuring to a saint might be prescribed. You would take a long piece of clean twine or a colorful ribbon, and with the utmost gentleness and quiet reverence, you would measure the sick person from the crown of their head to the soles of their feet. Then, you would measure them again, from the fingertip of one outstretched hand to the other. This string, now imbued with the precise physical dimension, the very measure of the sufferer, became a sacred proxy. It was no longer just a piece of twine. It was an extension of the person themselves. This measured string would be carefully coiled and then, with murmured prayers, repeatedly dipped in warm, melted beeswax until it formed a thin, pliable candle. This was not an object to be burned at the humble hearth. A healthy family member, perhaps a determined spouse or a devoted child, would be tasked with a pilgrimage. They would carry this unique candle, carefully wrapped in cloth, on a journey that might take days or even weeks. Their destination was the distant shrine of a powerful saint, known for healing perhaps Saint Roch, the protector against plague, or Saint Apollonia for a toothache. There, amidst the throng of other hopeful pilgrims, the low murmur of 100 prayers, and the glittering light of 1,000 other candles, they would light their waxy string. As it burned, the smoke, fragrant with beeswax, carried the measure of their loved one, a direct and physical appeal, up to the heavens. The saint, one hoped, appreciated the gesture, though they might have preferred a slightly less flammable form of devotion. The profound belief was that as the last of the string turned to ash, the illness it represented would be consumed along with it, burned away by the heat of unwavering faith. It is in these very practices that you can feel the tension of the age. Theologians and historians alike still debate the blurry and often crossed line between an approved religious sacramental and what the church would condemn as a forbidden magical superstition. Holy water, blessed by a priest in a church, was a powerful and entirely sanctioned tool for purification. You could sprinkle it on your doorway to bar entry to evil spirits, on your farming tools to ensure a good harvest, or on your children's foreheads for protection. It was official, approved, and holy, but was a pouch of unsanctioned herbs and salt, gathered according to folk wisdom, fundamentally different in its intent. A priest might bless a pilgrim's badge, a small lead token from a shrine, making it a holy object that could ward off harm. But was the intricate, heartfelt ritual of measuring to a saint a beautiful act of desperate faith, or a dangerous slide into pagan magic that sought to bind or compel a holy figure? For the parish priest, trying to guide his flock, this could be a source of immense difficulty. He might have needed a very detailed flowchart to keep track of what was approved folk piety and what was damnable sorcery. For the average person, this theological distinction was a source of quiet, background anxiety. In the face of sickness, starvation, or fear, they used what was available, what felt right, and what their ancestors had told them worked. They would devoutly cross themselves and recite their prayers, but they would also hang a bundle of St. John's wort over the door on Midsummer's Eve to ward off witches. They sought the formal intercession of the saints in church, but they also avoided spilling salt without tossing a pinch over their left shoulder. It was a layered, more pragmatic approach to spiritual safety, an attempt to build a defense from every possible quarry, whether it was dug from the bedrock of official doctrine or plucked from the wild fields of folk belief. The ultimate goal, after all, was simple and universal: to make it safely through the night and to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. One prayer, one charm, one carefully measured string at a time. He caberbatien to bersauf, when all the whispered prayers have faded, when every herbal remedy has been tried and found wanting, and when the subtle signs of spiritual malaise deepen into something more profound and unsettling. You find yourself contemplating the most extreme scenario. The community, the family, and the church itself are forced to confront the possibility of full demonic possession. This is not a matter for simple blessings or a stern talking to anymore. It is a moment that calls for the ultimate weapon in the church's spiritual arsenal, the final solemn response to an entity that has dug its claws deep into the soul of a parishioner. This is the solemn rite of exorcism. You must picture the gravity of this decision. It was not made lightly. The formal rite of exorcism was an established, if thankfully rare, liturgical practice in the Catholic Church. This was not improvised theater. It was a carefully structured ceremony, with specific prayers and rituals codified in a book, the Ritual Romanum, Mamur. These texts were designed with a singular, powerful purpose to command a demon, in the name of God, to relinquish its hold and depart from its human host. The priest chosen for this task was not just any cleric. He had to be a man of unimpeachable piety, profound faith, and considerable courage. He was, in essence, a spiritual soldier preparing for a direct confrontation on a battlefield the rest of us cannot see. His preparations would be methodical. In the quiet of the sacristy, you can almost hear the soft clink of the items being gathered. A silver crucifix, its surface worn smooth by countless anxious hands. A small vessel of holy water, its contents blessed with ancient prayers. The priest's purple stole, the symbol of his authority and office, laid out carefully. And, of course, the book itself, its leather cover heavy, and its pages filled with the commanding words of the rite in Latin. The room chosen for the ordeal would be deliberately stark and private, perhaps a small, unused chapel or a quiet room in the rectory, its windows shuttered against the curious eyes of the village. The air inside would grow thick and still, heavy with the scent of a single beeswax candle, its flame a lone point of light in the gathering gloom, before the rite could truly begin. However, there had to be certainty. The church was wary of mistaking mental illness or simple fraud for genuine possession. And so, a key part of the process involved a series of tests to confirm the demonic presence. This is where a quirky and unsettling diagnostic process unfolded. Imagine the priest, his face a mask of calm concentration, approaching the afflicted person. He might make the sign of the cross, watching for a reaction of unnatural rage or terror. He would sprinkle holy water, not with grand dramatic gestures, but with a quiet deliberation, observing if the individual recoiled as if from a hot iron. Sometimes, the most compelling evidence was auditory. The afflicted might begin speaking in languages they had never learned, a phenomenon known as glossolalia. It must have been quite a shock for a humble farmer to suddenly begin berating a priest in fluent, if rather angry, Latin. One imagines it's not the ideal way to learn a new language, but it certainly made a strong impression. These tests were the threshold. If the reactions were violent and undeniable, the priest would proceed. He would begin the rite, his voice, usually so gentle in confession or sermon, taking on a new tone, one of command, of unwavering authority. He would recite the litany of the saints, calling upon a heavenly army for support. Then came the core of the exorcism, the direct adjurations, Exi ergo, immunde spiritus, he would command. Go, therefore, unclean spirit. It was a battle of wills, a spiritual siege. The priest, armed only with his faith and the authority of the church, against an entity defined by its rebellion against that very authority. It's a bit like serving an eviction notice to the universe's most stubborn and malicious tenant, one who has no intention of leaving quietly, and certainly isn't concerned about getting their security deposit back. Yet, as we picture this formal, dramatic scene, we must pause. Historians still argue whether the majority of exorcisms performed at a village level were these formal, book-bound rites. It's a compelling image, but the reality on the ground, in isolated hamlets far from the bishop's oversight, was likely quite different. For every formal exorcism, there may have been a dozen much more informal affairs. Picture a different scene, a desperate family calling upon their local priest, a man they've known their whole lives. He might not have the specific training or the official sanction. He arrives not with a full retinue, but alone, clutching his personal rosary. The rite is not a polished recitation from the Ritual Romanum, Malden, but a raw or heartfelt outpouring of desperate prayers and blessings over the afflicted. He uses what he has, his faith, the power of the sacraments he can administer, and a deep pastoral love for his flock. It's less a formal legal proceeding and more like spiritual first aid, administered with trembling hands, but a resolute heart. The aftermath of either ritual, formal or informal, was often one of profound exhaustion. The room, once filled with shouting and prayer, would fall into a heavy silence, broken only by the shuddering breaths of the afflicted and the weary sighs of the priest. Sometimes the resolution was clear and immediate, a moment of catharsis, of release, as if a great weight had been lifted. The person would return to themselves, dazed and weak, but free. Other times, the conclusion was far more ambiguous. The symptoms might recede, the violent outbursts might cease, but a shadow of the affliction would remain, leaving everyone to wonder if the entity was truly gone, or merely lying dormant. After such a spiritual ordeal, you have to assume that everyone involved, including the demon, was probably in desperate need of a long nap, and in that quiet, fragile peace, the community was left to pick up the pieces, to care for the drained survivor, and to pray that the darkness, in whatever form it had taken, would not return. And so, your thoughts drift, expanding from the singular demon in the shadows to the ultimate, collective fear. The personal anxiety you might feel about a tempter whispering in your ear now scales up to a cosmic level, to a fear for the world itself. You begin to contemplate the final act, the great and terrible conclusion foretold in Scripture and elaborated upon in countless sermons. You are thinking about the end of the world, a time when the flimsy veil between earth and hell would be torn asunder, unleashing every last demon for one final, desperate battle. This was not a vague or distant idea. For the medieval mind, it was an inevitability, a promised event on the divine calendar. It was the roar of the apocalypse. At the heart of this grand, terrifying drama was a singular figure, a concept that dominated medieval eschatology, the theology of the end times. This was the Antichrist. He was the centerpiece of the final act, the ultimate demonic deception. He would not appear with horns and a pitchfork, smelling of sulfur and announcing his evil intent. No, the true horror of the Antichrist was in his disguise. He would be a demonic parody of Christ, a dark mirror reflecting and twisting every virtue. He was prophesied to be charismatic, wise and handsome, capable of performing miracles that would awe and inspire. He would arrive in a time of chaos and promise order, bringing a false peace to a weary world. Nations would hail him as a savior. He would solve famines, end wars, and be lauded as the one true leader humanity had been waiting for. And under his benevolent rule, he would command legions of demons, hidden in plain sight. Working his will, they would be his advisors, his enforcers, his secret police, whispering corruption into the ears of the powerful while the world celebrated a golden age. Only after his power was absolute, after the world had willingly given itself over to him, would the mask fall, revealing the fathomless evil beneath. This was the mainstream fact of the age. The final test of humanity would not be a simple battle of good versus evil, but a trial of discernment, a challenge to see the demon hiding behind the face of an angel. This cosmic dread wasn't just for scholars poring over the Book of Revelation in chilly scriptoriums. The quirky tidbit is that common folk had their own checklist for the end of days, looking for specific signs that the final curtain was about to rise. The universe, they believed, would give them warnings. Imagine yourself as a farmer, leaning on a rough-hewn fence after a long day in the fields, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and tired livestock. You look up at the vast, dark tapestry of the night sky, a sweep of stars untouched by modern light pollution. And then you see it a comet, a fuzzy star with a long, ghostly tail, streaking silently across the heavens. Your breath would catch in your throat. Is this it? Is this the sign in the sky the priest spoke of? A wave of unease would wash over the village. Whispers would travel from cottage to cottage, carried on the smoke of evening fires. Plagues that swept through a region, famines that left bellies aching and gaunt, wars that seemed unending, all were interpreted as the horsemen of the apocalypse beginning their ride. Even nature itself seemed to participate in the anxious watch. The birth of a deformed animal, a calf with 2 heads or a lamb with 6 legs, was not just a biological anomaly. It was a portent, a sign that the natural order was breaking down, a grotesque herald of the chaos to come. That 2-headed calf might have been a local celebrity for a week, but it was a celebrity whose fame was rooted in a deep existential dread. And yet, it's a matter of ongoing discussion just how much the average illiterate villager actively worried about the apocalypse on a daily basis. Was it a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of everyday life? Or was it a more abstract concern, brought out for sermons or during times of exceptional hardship? For the theologian, surrounded by ancient texts and prophecies, the timeline of the end times might have been a pressing, intellectual puzzle. He could spend his days debating the precise nature of the Antichrist's reign or the exact number of demons in a legion, all while his lunch of lentil soup grew cold. But for the peasant, whose world was circumscribed by the village and the changing seasons, the concerns were likely more immediate. The fear of a failed harvest was far more tangible than the fear of a theological final judgment. A sick child, a lame horse, a leaky roof. These were the apocalypses of the everyday. Perhaps the end of the world was like a distant thunderstorm. You could hear the faint rumble and knew it was out there, and you might glance at the horizon now and then. But until the sky darkened directly overhead and the first drops of rain began to fall, your focus remained on mending the fence, feeding the chickens, and getting through the day. The grand cosmic battle was God's business. The small bersambo, personal battles were yours. The fear was real, but like all fears, it had to compete for attention with the endless, pressing demands of being alive. The long dark night of our journey through this world of palpable fear is finally ending. You can almost feel it in the air, a subtle shift. Imagine the first thin rays of dawn, pale and hesitant, slicing through the mist clinging to the fields. For the people we've been observing, this light did not just signal the start of a new day of labor. It was a reprieve. As the sun climbed, the oppressive, immediate terror of what lurked in the darkness would begin to recede, like a tide pulling away from the shore. But it is crucial to understand that this worldview, this constant awareness of the demonic, was not simply a nighttime affliction. The journey we've taken comes full circle here, as we recognize that the fear was an all-encompassing reality. A farmer did not just fear a blight on his crops, he feared the specific demons sent to sour his fields. A mother did not just fear a fever in her child, she feared the malevolent spirit that had taken root in their small body. The daylight world was just as enchanted, just as fraught with supernatural peril, as the night. The demons were merely better lit. This intensely personal and pervasive demonic worldview, which had held sway over the European mind for a millennium, did not vanish overnight. It began to slowly erode, like a great stone cliff worn down by a persistent sea. The first waves of this change arrived with the advent of the Reformation. As new theological ideas challenged the monolithic authority of the old church, it inadvertently taught people to question long-held certainties. If the sacred traditions of centuries could be re-examined, perhaps the old folk explanations for worldly phenomena could be, too. But the true solvent of this supernatural reality was the scientific rationalism of the Enlightenment. Suddenly, a comet streaking across the sky was not a fiery portent of doom sent by a wrathful god, but a predictable celestial event, its path calculable with mathematics. Disease, while still terrifying, began to be seen not as a spiritual affliction, but as a biological process, something that could potentially be understood and, one day, combated. The world was being mapped, measured, and explained. Each new law of physics, each new medical observation was a candle lit in the dark, pushing the shadows of the old fears further and further back. The universe was becoming less of a haunted house and more of a complex, intricate, but ultimately knowable machine. Yet, even as the grand theological terror faded, its ghosts lingered on in the most surprising of places, our own daily habits. This is the quirky tidbit of our final section, the surprising persistence of many demon-related folk superstitions as cultural tics, long after the belief that powered them has all but vanished. When you say, knock on wood, to avoid jinxing yourself, you're echoing a very ancient practice. Depending on the tradition, you were either tapping the tree to awaken a benevolent nature spirit to protect your good fortune, or you were making a noise to distract a jealous demon who might overhear your happy pronouncement and seek to ruin it. It was a tiny piece of spiritual insurance. Similarly, when you cross your fingers for good luck, you are performing a miniaturized, almost unconscious version of making the sign of the cross a quick, portable ward against evil influence. It's a bit like finding ancient, forgotten code still running quietly in the background of our modern social software. We execute the command without ever knowing its original, deadly serious purpose. These small rituals are the cultural fossils of a world we can now only visit in our imaginations. And this leads us to one final, lingering thought, a deep and unresolved question that scholars and thinkers continue to ponder. A philosophical debate continues on whether our modern anxieties are simply secularized versions of these older, more tangible supernatural fears. We may no longer fear a coven of witches cursing our village, but we harbor a deep-seated dread of invisible contagion, of a virus shutting down the entire globe. We no longer attribute economic ruin to a specific demon of greed, but we feel a profound anxiety about abstract market forces, of algorithms and bubbles that can erase a life's savings in an instant. The fear of social decay, of our communities unraveling, echoes the old terror of chaos and the breakdown of God's order. Have we truly escaped the demons of the past? Or have we just given them new, more clinical names? The medieval peasant feared a named entity with horns and a tail. We fear a statistical probability, a line on a graph, a warming planet. The source of our fear has become more abstract, more impersonal, but the cold grip it can have on our hearts feels hauntingly familiar. It suggests that perhaps the human need to identify and name the great unseen forces that shape our lives is a constant, a fundamental part of our experience, simply changing its costume to match the spirit of the age. And so, our long walk through the night of history comes to a gentle close. The first rays of dawn we spoke of are no longer just a metaphor for the Enlightenment, but a soft light you might see beginning to touch the edges of your own window. Let the world we have explored begin to recede. Let the weight of its fears and the texture of its beliefs soften, dissolving from a tangible reality back into a story that has been told. The anxieties of that time, the palpable dread of a demon in the dark, the chill of a curse whispered on the wind can now be laid to rest. They belong to the past, and you are here, in the quiet comfort of the present. Feel the safety of your own space. The steady, quiet hum of the world outside your room is not the sound of watchful spirits, but of electricity, of distant traffic, of the gentle mechanics of modern life. The warmth of your blanket is a profound luxury, a shield of comfort against a cold that, for so many in our story, was a constant, biting reality. The darkness in your room is a peaceful, chosen darkness, not a realm teeming with hungry shadows. You can let go of the vigilance that our ancestors had to carry every single moment. You can release that tension from your shoulders, from your mind. Let the narrative fade like a dream upon waking. The figures we met, the lives we witnessed, the world we tried to understand. They can all drift away now on a gentle current, leaving only a sense of peace behind. There are no more trials to witness, no more hardships to endure. There is only the stillness of your room, the soft rise and fall of your own breath, and the deep, welcoming quiet of the approaching sleep. The story is over. It is time to rest. Drift now into the quiet of your own peaceful night.